I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Rosie.
I'm Jake.
And this is our podcast on Little Women and Little Men. And we're going to be talking about the film adaptations, and also there's a mini-series we'll be talking about, but Jake hasn't seen that one.
Yeah, I won't be talking about that much, but I'll say a couple of things about the adaptations I've seen.
We'll start with Little Women, and I thought what I'd do, I'd give a sort of overview of all the adaptations, and then we could talk about the characters one by one, and how they are in all the different adaptations. The first Little Women film with sound was made in 1933. I read somewhere that it was made because talkies, as they used to call them, talking pictures, were quite new, and they were seeing if people would like a literary adaptation. And I read all sorts of interesting things about the history of talking pictures, and I read that people thought that it was a bad idea to have sound in films because it would detract from the cinematography and things like that. And I read that the first ever talking picture wasn't really much of a story, it was mostly just a man singing jazz. It's very interesting. But anyway, what I read about Little Women seems to ring true. If you look up other classics, you'll find that they were first adapted with sound later than 1933. The one exception I've found is Dracula, which was adapted with sound in 1931, but I think they were looking at that more as a horror movie than a beloved classic. And it went down very well, and it won an Academy Award. I think they had Academy Awards back then, didn't they?
Yes, indeed, they're as old as the Hollywood movie industry, the Oscars.
So that's very interesting, and I think it's a very good adaptation. It's certainly the one where, with the casting, they've paid the most attention to the descriptions in the book. It's the only one where Jo is the tallest, for instance. In fact, I think in all the others she might be the shortest little woman played by an actress over 12. Then another film was made in 1949, and that's actually my least favourite, for reasons I'll go into when we talk about the characters. But I still like it. And whenever I've watched either the 1933 version or the 1949 version, and I haven't seen either of them recently, I think, I'm sure that bit of dialogue's in the other one. And then I watched them quite close together recently, and it was quite a lot of the dialogue, so I thought, how on earth did they get away with that in 1949, using sort of 80% of the same script? So I looked it up, and the original 1933 script writers do have writing credits, and I started to think, well, I suppose that bit comes straight out of the book. But then when it's Jo in New York with the professor, it's word for word exactly the same dialogue, and that's not straight out of the book, so that's what made me look it up and realise how very similar they were. It does just enough of its own thing to make you believe that they've read the book, and it gets a couple of scenes out of the book that aren't in the 1933 version. But what's quite interesting about it is that it's by the same production company as The Wizard of Oz, and that's interesting if you like The Wizard of Oz like I do, and stylistically it is quite similar. The 1978 miniseries is good. I'd be reluctant to say it's better or worse than any of the films because it's very different. People say that it's the truest to the book. I don't think that's quite right. I don't think people have thought that through. What they mean is that it goes into the most detail and covers the most events from the book, because it's got time to do that. It's got an hour's runtime, at least, on the three films. But it does put its own spin on things. For instance, it messes about with Laurie and grandfather's family structure and says that the girl who died, who had the piano, who Mr. Lawrence was fond of, if you know the story, you'll know what I mean. They say that was actually Laurie's mother, and his father was the Italian, and he's actually got an Italian surname that his grandfather doesn't let him use, whereas in the book and in the three films, Grandfather Lawrence is Laurie's paternal grandfather, and the mother was the Italian. You know, the sort of thing. Another thing people say about that one is, oh, it's so 70s, the costumes are so 70s and the wigs are so 70s, but given that it was made in 1978, I think that's okay. Then there's the 1994 film version, which Jake has seen.
Less than a week ago, but not for the first time.
So he'll be able to tell us what he thinks about that one. It is my personal favourite, although being objective, I've found that some of the other adaptations have things over it. I think what it really boils down to is which one you grew up with. When people are on the internet discussing which is their favourite Little Women film, quite often it's the one that was around when they were a child. And our aunt, who was born in the early 40s, likes the 1949 version, doesn't she?
Yes, that must be very much influenced by her childhood memories and feelings. I think Little Women 1994 is quite a beautifully made film, a film that makes you think about family and the passage of time. The music is very effective. And when I was watching it less than a week ago, it really struck me how there's a lot of content that you just get a little sneak peek into, and is obviously elaborated on a lot more in the book, as of course always happens with a book adaptation. And you've said to me, haven't you, that people say it's got a lot of the book in there and it does well not concentrating on just Jo as the main character. And that's true, but there were all sorts of little details that they didn't have time to put in that you were elaborating to me. So I think that's good for a film, get a taste of everything. I think it creates a good effect. And I think as a family movie, a childhood movie, a coming-of-age movie, it's very good.
Yes, you're very right. The 1933 and 49 versions have fewer events from the book, but go into more detail about them, so you perhaps get a better or a fuller overall feel of the story. So you could debate for hours which approach is better. So now we'll go back to the beginning, 1933, and talk about the supporting characters first, I think. Of course, what you have to remember about 1933, because talking pictures were very new, the acting style is very sort of elaborate, and they shout, and they what we would nowadays call overact, and they make very expressive gestures and expressive facial expressions, because of course they've been used to acting in silent films and acting on the stage. So some people who can't appreciate historical context have difficulty enjoying films such as the 1933 version of Little Women. But as I said, I think it's very good. But I'm going to talk about the supporting cast, aren't I? Who would that be? John Brooke, he's just a sort of man, and Aunt March. It's the only film which has Aunt March's parrot, that's a bit of trivia for you. And she's a sort of bossy old woman. And Grandfather Lawrence, who's a sort of man with a white beard. And I don't have an awful lot to say about them. I don't think their performances are particularly memorable, but they're all very good in their roles anyway. I do find the supporting cast more memorable in 1949, and the reason why that is, I worked this out quite recently. Everyone is playing either a caricature in that film, or they're a complete plank of wood, and I'll talk about them later, but two of those three characters, Aunt March and Grandfather, are very much caricatures. John Brooke, I suppose, comes into the plank of wood category, and I don't think I'm going to say anything else about 1949 John Brooke, so that was it. But Aunt March, you can imagine a caricature of a fussy, bossy, sort of old-fashioned, disapproving aunt, can't you?
Very much so.
And that's very much how Aunt March is played. She has a sort of very high voice and bustles about, and that kind of thing. It doesn't have her poodle, and it doesn't have her parrot, which is a shame. Bit of homage to the book there, but never mind. Grandfather, arguably, is the best in 1949. I'm very reluctant to say who I think is the best actor or portrayal of the character, because they have three very different styles. You have the elaborate, very much a performance in the 1930s. You have this kind of caricature sort of thing in the 1940s. And then 1994, it's more kind of realistic, isn't it?
That's interesting. It interests me how you say caricatures for the 49 one. It reminds me of The Wizard of Oz, as you were saying, made by the same studio. And we might even podcast about that properly one day.
We might well.
But I think it'd be fair to say that the performances in The Wizard of Oz 1939 are quite caricature-y or very easily accessible. A couple of characteristics, bright costumes very much show you who everyone is and what their role is, very much thinking of the Wicked Witch of the West there. So saying that it's made in the same style, Little Women and The Wizard of Oz, by the same studio, has rung true to me while you were talking about it just now.
That's good. It does have the bright costumes. It's very colourful, of course. They were very pleased to be able to make it in colour. But anyway, why do I say arguably Grandfather is the best? It's because, for me, he's the most like he is in the book, because Louisa writes him very much as a caricature of a grumpy old man with a heart of gold, and when she's describing him, she writes about his big bushy eyebrows and that kind of thing, which he certainly has in the 1949 film. And I think I'm not going to say that much about John Neville, the 1994 Grandfather. I was very quick on the 1933 Grandfather, so whether or not you want to say he's the best, he certainly made the most impression on me. The 1978 Grandfather I can talk about now, can't I? He's played by someone who's supposed to be quite famous, I think, called William Shallot. Have you ever heard of him?
No.
He gets sort of top billing on promotional kind of websites and Amazon and stuff if you're trying to buy the DVD, along with William Shatner. And it says Little Women starring William Shallot and William Shatner.
Perhaps they just did it because they look nice together with their names.
It certainly does make one chuckle if one hasn't got anything better to do. He is also very memorable in the role because with the extra time that they have to go into things, you see a lot more of his difficult relationship with Laurie. I can't think of anything in particular to say about the way that he plays the character like I could with 1949 Grandfather. Now, I'm only going to say the names of the actors I can remember. He was, in 1978, an old man with a white beard. He was a good actor, and I think he's fine in the role of Grandfather. But I don't really want to say anything else about him. Nothing else leaps out at me. So let's talk about John Neville now. Do you want to say something about John Neville, Jake?
You were saying to me, after we'd watched it quite recently, you get the idea of Grandfather from John Neville, what he does in the film, what he's given to do in the film, the quite crotchety old man with the heart of gold. But it's one of these things that you only really get a peek of when he gives Beth the piano and talks about his dead daughter. You haven't really had the build-up with the relationship with Beth. And I could see there'd be more to that in the book than there was on the screen. But you certainly do get the essence of the character very well. I used to find John Neville interesting in the film in the mid-90s when you first had the video, because he was in the X-Files at the time, playing one of the shady FBI baddies, possibly in the shadows, which is why I always remember that he's in it, just as a side point.
A very versatile actor. When I first saw the 1994 film, I'd read the book once, if you see what I mean. My mum read it to me. So I didn't remember every detail, so I picked up what the characters were supposed to be like from the film more than from my first reading of the book. And then when I went back and read the book again when I was older, the storylines and things were expanded on for me, and I thought, oh yes, now I see why John Neville's grumpied at the coachman and why Joe doesn't get on so well with Aunt March and that kind of thing. So you very much get the idea from that film, but as you say, you don't get a lot of details. And the relationship between Beth and Grandfather Lawrence is one of the things that in 1949 and 1933 they do go into a lot of detail, and I think it's possibly one of the bits where they use the exact same script as well. But a lot of that is taken directly from the book, so it's why I didn't notice for a while. But what does John Neville do? He's grumpy with the coachman. He tells Laurie to stop looking at the little women and hurry up and get in the carriage. And then a bit later he comes round for Christmas and is happy and gives Beth a piano. And you don't really get everything about the character, do you?
No, I got that Beth's illness and her brush with death, which she had in the first part of the film, had made Grandfather Lawrence kind of mellow and realise that life is too short and precious to be grumpy, and he should just get on and give her the piano and open his heart to the March family before one of them dies.
Oh, well, that's good. I think that's very much what they were going for. Of course, he brings his personal physician, Dr. Bangs, to look at Beth, doesn't he?
That's right, that's his big crossover moment in the movie.
Which is different from the book. He doesn't do that in the book, and Dr. Bangs is the family doctor, and he's been looking at Beth all along. But they've adapted that to get across the message that they were wanting in the film.
Again, it's getting the essence in there for the viewer to understand, which they've done jolly well.
Did you get from the film how Laurie is materially rich, but he's deprived in terms of family and fun and love? So he's sort of the opposite of the Marches, and that's why they form this very special relationship, and they sort of swap.
Yes, I think the main bit of the film that might show that to the uninformed viewer is where Joe and one of the other little women spying on Laurie or having a look at him through the window while he sits lonely doing his studious work, and they discuss what his life's like, their lives are like, and how they can interact and maybe help each other to fulfill what's missing from their lives. Who does she discuss that with? I think it's Beth.
It's all four of them, isn't it?
Oh, is it?
Yeah, when they're dressed up as the Pickwick cast.
They're all spying on him.
Yes, they're all in their costumes playing the Pickwick Papers, and he's on his own with his piano, so I suppose that's quite well staged, isn't it?
An effective bit of juxtaposition there that works on screen. I got it.
And Beth says about Grandfather, I'd be terrified to live with him, and Joe calls him an awful old man, so you get a bit of telling rather than showing there to help you get an idea of the character.
She thinks John Brooke's an awful old man too, doesn't she, in that movie?
Yeah, she thinks he's dull as powder. And yes, we'll talk about him, won't we, now that we've talked about Grandfather? Did you get that Joe was resistant to change and didn't want John breaking up the family?
Yes, very much so. She even says at one point, why do we have to get married at all? Why can't things stay as they are? And that's very much backed up by all Joe's actions and reactions to changes in the family. And it's very much how a lot of us feel, I think, moving out of childhood. Why can't everything stay the same? Why do things have to change? Which is why I say it's about life, it's about family, it's about growing up.
Good, yes, I think you get from the film very much the gist of it, like I did when I was a child.
Yes, that's quite good, really, for me. It's what I wanted from the film, the gist of the whole story, rather than lots of in-depth stuff that I didn't really know the background of from reading it a lot. I think it's a good one for families, children, accessible.
John Brooke is, anyway, played by Eric Stoltz, who we know from The Fly 2, which is an extremely emotional performance, isn't it? He doesn't have such a big role in Little Women. What did you think of him?
Yes, it's difficult to judge, really, isn't it?
I think he's fine in the role, a sort of quiet, serious tutor who's in love with Meg.
He doesn't really have a lot to do. Kind of people's reactions to him that make the character. I suppose it's quite effective when he's talking to Meg after the theatre, and Joe, again, it's her reaction to him, thinks he's being terribly boring. And Eric Stoltz manages to play it like, yes, I can see how that can sound boring to Joe, but sophisticated to Meg. So he certainly does what's asked of him, I think.
Yes, he's fine in the film, and now I'm thinking about John Brooke in the miniseries that we haven't talked about yet, so now we have to sort of go backwards a bit, and we'll come back to Aunt March, shall we? I don't remember the name of the actor of John Brooke in 1978, sorry about that. And I'm thinking about it, and the bit I remember most is from part 2. It's essentially a 2-part miniseries where the first half is an adaptation of book 1 and the second half is an adaptation of book 2, which in this country, by the way, is published separately and called Good Wives, which I have read is a title Louisa never approved, so I quite like to call them book 1 and book 2 because she called them both Little Women. Anyway, what's quite interesting about John Brooke in the miniseries is that you get a little bit of his married life with Meg. It adapts a scene from book 2 that you won't see in any other adaptation, where Meg is struggling to be married to a poor man while her friend Sally is married to a rich man, Ned Moffat, and buying all the clothes and stuff that she wants, and Meg ends up being pressured into buying this very expensive silk for a new dress, and John can't afford his new overcoat, which he really needs. And it finishes up with Meg selling the silk to Sally and buying the overcoat for John, and she says, oh, look at my new dress, John, close your eyes, and all that kind of thing. And then when he opens his eyes, she's wearing the overcoat, and they make up the little issue. And it actually says in the book something like, the reader can imagine how John made up the quarrel, and then the year rolled around and Meg had twins. But I don't know exactly what she meant by that, if the two incidents were supposed to be directly related. But anyway, that's probably the most John Brooke gets to do in any adaptation. And it's a very memorable scene, so he must play it quite well, mustn't he?
I'd imagine so.
Although I am struggling to remember, and I only saw it quite recently, I'm struggling to remember him in part one getting to the point of Meg agreeing to marry him. In 1933 and 1949, he gets to do very little, but then towards the middle, he does proposing to Meg with the exact same script, which mostly comes directly out of the book. But apart from that overcoat scene in the miniseries, there's not a lot of specific things to say about John Brooke. So we'll talk about Aunt March now, shall we? I already talked about her in 1949. In 1978, she's Greta Garbo, who is very famous, and I did know the name. I couldn't say anything else that she's been in.
She's from the very early days of Hollywood, which I guess is why she was old in the late 70s.
And they make her sort of quite comedic with her ghastliness, but they also get round to her being good at heart when she's bringing money for Mommy to go to Washington and see Father in the hospital. In the films, either she says, I'm not giving you any money, and Jo goes off and sells her hair for that reason, or in 1994, they don't even include her in that bit. But in the miniseries, she comes around with some money and starts being all like, oh, I told him not to go to the war, and going on about money, and Jo storms off and sells her hair. But then she gives Mommy the money she needs and says, wire if you need more, and all that kind of thing. So you really see the two different sides to her character there, and she's very good. And in 1994, she's played by Mary Wicks. What did you think of Mary Wicks?
You very much get it, don't you?
Again, quite comical in parts, when she and Mommy are having tea, and when Jo's shouting to Meg about gloves, and Aunt March sort of covers her ears going, oh, like she doesn't approve.
She always makes it very clear she has certain standards and expectations for her relations, especially if they want to get any money out of her. And yes, she's played quite a caricaturish way. It works very well.
Did you get that she takes a shine to Amy and ends up preferring her to Jo when Amy has to go and live with her during the Scarlet Fever?
Yes, you do get that, mainly from the fact that she chooses to take Amy to France instead of Jo, and Jo's terribly disappointed.
That's something they go into the most detail with in the miniseries, because they've got time. You have a scene where Amy is making herself appealing to Aunt March, and Aunt March is saying, oh, if you were Jo, you would have stormed out in a huff, and all that kind of thing. And you hardly get it at all in the other two versions. When Aunt March and Amy are going to Europe, which doesn't happen in the book, by the way, she goes with Aunt Carol, who's hardly ever even in it. And in the miniseries, she goes with Aunt Carol as well. But anyway, you hardly see Amy and Aunt March together in the films. And Jo's already in New York, and they come and say, we're going to Europe together. And Amy says to Jo, oh, Jo, I know you wanted to go. And Jo says, oh, that's all right, Amy. And it's, again, the same script both times. And she says, you've always done sweet things to please Aunt March. And you sort of think, oh, has she? All right, then, if you say so.
I thought it was quite effective in the 94 when Amy comes in and says, Aunt March is off to Europe at last. Obviously she's taking me, I'm her companion now. She wouldn't have thought of anyone else. And Jo's like, right, okay then. I spend all that time reading to her, looking after her, and she's forgotten all about me, fine.
Of course, you see young Amy reading the Bible to Aunt March, don't you? And you're supposed to get from that, I think, that Aunt March is getting to like her.
Sanctuary.
Yes, correcting her pronunciation there. And Kirsten Dunst, who plays Amy, who we'll talk about later, got a slight chuckle out of you, I think, didn't she, with her sort of sigh when Aunt March told her to carry on reading.
She made it very clear how she felt about the situation.
Now, I've talked about Grandfather, John Brooke, and Aunt March in all four adaptations, haven't I? So now we better talk about other characters. I suppose I'll go into the next phase with Jo, because she is the main character. Now, I always say, and bore Jake with it, when Louisa wrote both the Little Women books, book 1 and book 2, she didn't really intend Jo to be the main character. People, I think, are influenced by knowing that she's based on the author, and also the book kind of finishes up with what happens to her. But until then, all the sisters have their own little adventures and chapters, and it is called Little Women, not Little Woman. But even so, the 1933 version and the 1949 version very much make Jo the protagonist, and this is true in 1994 as well. The actress playing Jo is always the one who was the most famous at the time. In 1933, she was played by Katharine Hepburn, and as I was saying earlier, Katharine Hepburn is tall and long-limbed, as Jo is described in the book, and that's very important if you know about Victorian standards of beauty and fitting in, and you're not supposed to be too tall and thin. The book also describes her as having brown skin. I mean, she's a white person, but she's darker than Meg, for instance. But that doesn't really come across in black and white. And all the sisters have curly hair in 1933, which I do like, because it's a sort of family trait. Almost all the grandchildren are described as having curly hair at some point. But anyway, back to Katharine Hepburn. You, as I was saying, have to appreciate the context of when it was made and understand the acting style to like her performance as Jo. And I do like her performance as Jo, and it's very sort of theatrical. What kind of character is Jo supposed to be, Jake?
Well, Jo is a tomboyish character who doesn't like to conform to social conventions, and is quite rebellious in that way, and wants to take on the world and win, certainly when she's younger.
That's right. And the way Katharine Hepburn portrays this is that she speaks sort of quite loudly, or in a kind of masculine way, if you like, and she sort of swaggers and lollops, and it's very theatrical. It's like a sort of interpretive dance in a way. But a couple of times she has to sing and dance in fun, and it's very professional, much more professional than the real Jo would have been. So it's a very interesting example of how parts were played in the 1930s when talking pictures were very new. So yes, I do like Katharine Hepburn. She looks like Jo, and she certainly understood the character. 1949, June Allison played Jo. I never heard of her when I first watched it when I was in my early to mid-teens, but she gets top billing, along with Margaret O'Brien, who plays Beth, and they were the more famous pair of actresses at the time in 1949, but I'd heard of Janet Leigh and Elizabeth Taylor, who played Meg and Amy, but I'll talk about them later. June Allison is the only one in these 4 adaptations I'm talking about to have played a little woman in her 30s. She was not very tall, which means that my first thought is, well, she doesn't look like Jo, but possibly it helped her to get a part as a teenager. And yeah, she was the big Hollywood name that they wanted to draw the crowds. And when I was watching the film quite recently, Jake actually made a comment about what he'd heard her doing through My Bedroom Wall.
Oh yes, she reminded me of Doris Day as Calamity Jane, which is a tomboyish performance, as it were, kind of female character playing up to a male stereotype, which I think you thought very much fit in with what was going on.
Yes, again, a caricature. Now, Jo does have to change the way that she acts from book 1 to book 2, when there's a bit of a time slip. She has to act more grown up. And June Allison and Katharine Hepburn both stopped kind of doing that kind of extreme performance of being a tomboy, and they act more like women, which is fine. My personal feeling about June Allison's performance is that I don't love it, but then I don't love any of the performances in that film, because I don't really connect with that caricature kind of style as much as I do with the more modern style. And I don't really understand it as well as I understand the 1930s acting. I can understand why they were overacting in the way that they were. I can't really see the thinking behind the caricatures because I wasn't around at the time. Having said that, she certainly does what she's supposed to do and understands the character. Some people don't like the fact that she's 32. I don't mind. I don't think she looks too much older than the others, even though she's 10 years older than the next oldest. In 1978, the miniseries, she's played by Susan Day, and she's very good. She has a lot to do because it's 2 parts of an hour and a half each, mostly following her. And I think you get everything. You get her friendship with Laurie, you get her ambitions to be a writer, and you get the anger that she feels when Amy burns her manuscript, and that one goes into much more detail than the 1994 version, with Amy falling through the ice and everything, where you don't really get how responsible Jo is, because she's neglected to make sure Amy's heard Laurie's advice not to skate too near the middle of the lake. But what she does best of all, I think, is the grief when Beth dies. In the film, it's really quite sort of quick, particularly the earlier 2. What did you think of the grieving for Beth in 1994? Did you think it was a bit too quick?
Well, it did all happen in very quick succession, and I think perhaps I was a little surprised they didn't spend a little longer on sitting around grieving, but I think I was quite pleased, actually. Like all that morbid stuff, I think they gave us, like the rest of the film, the taster of what's going on very effectively.
Good. They do spend longer on it than in the other 2 versions. In the 1978 miniseries, though, they sort of get on with the rest of their lives, but Jo is still feeling sad all the time and is sometimes reminded of Beth as the rest of the story goes on, which is more realistic, really, isn't it?
Because they've got the time to do it in a miniseries. Makes sense.
And she acts that very convincingly. And she also has some good chemistry with William Shatner, who I don't think I mentioned plays the Professor, Friedrich Baer, and I'll talk some more about him later.
He's Jo's eventual husband, if you didn't know.
And then in 1994, Jo is played by
Winona Ryder.
When I was young, I used to object to Winona Ryder being too pretty to play Jo, which possibly wasn't quite right. I don't know if she's a Victorian beauty. I think perhaps her nose isn't as straight as the Victorians would like. That's something I've picked up from all my reading. And you're supposed to have a really small mouth and very fair skin. So possibly she wasn't so pretty in Victorian times. Again, she's quite short, but never mind. She's not particularly brown either, so she doesn't look that much like Jo. I do think she's good at acting like Jo, and I think the transition from young Jo to grown-up Jo is very good. She's sort of acting like she doesn't quite feel comfortable, especially when she gets to the boarding house. That's when she starts wearing her hair up, like women, ladies, grown-up ladies are supposed to do. And I thought it was a more convincing continuation of the character than, for instance, Katharine Hepburn swaggering and lolloping about the place and then suddenly being a very kind of upright woman.
When you were first talking about the time skip, it made me think of Winona Ryder, because when we were watching it, I thought, yes, you can see how she's changed over those 4 years that we've skipped over. She was very much, as I said earlier, take on the world and win when she's the younger Jo. She wants to go around there and give it to Amy's teacher, who's whacked Amy across the hand. She thinks she can very much change the world for the better just by sheer force of will, and then 4 years later she's reluctantly, or as best she can, settling into life as a woman, an adult. It reminded me of a line from the film Dragonheart. I no longer try to change the world, Dragon, I just try to survive in it. I think we all experience that at some point in our lives, whether we're 12 or 22 or something in between. And I thought Jo had very much crossed that line during the time skip. I think Winona Ryder portrayed that well.
It's a very popular question on the internet, who's the best Jo? They don't include Susan Day, these people. They want to know what you think about the 3 film actresses. But as I say, I'm very reluctant to try and answer that question. Winona Ryder is my Jo. Katharine Hepburn looks the most like Jo. And June Allison, she's my least favourite. But they're all acting very different Joes. And it really just comes down to personal feeling. Now I'm going to talk about Meg. What kind of character is Meg?
Meg's an oldest sister type of character. character. She, perhaps, in some ways, has, airs and graces in some ways. She wants to be in a better position financially, socially than she is, but her main driving force is, of course, love of the family, love of the sisters, looking after her younger sisters when they need something. That's what I got about Meg.
Yes, that's very much what Louisa wanted you to get, I think. If you're naming her vice, in the book they each have a vice that they're trying to overcome. Hers is vanity.
Oh yes, that fits in, doesn't it?
Yeah, vanity, wildness, shyness and selfishness. And I was thinking about the 1933 version. I was thinking, what am I going to say about Meg? And I was wondering, does her vanity really come across? So much time is spent on Jo. You perhaps don't get as much of the characters of the other three as you need. But the bit I thought of where they do go into that was the lemonade stained gloves, and Jo saying, give me one of your nice gloves to wear, and Meg saying, don't stretch it, and all that kind of thing. She was played by Frances D, and I can't tell you anything else about her. She looks like Meg, as much as you can tell in black and white. She has fair skin, she's got dark hair, and she's sort of the size and shape that Victorians liked women to be. And she's very good in the role. The most she gets to do is the relationship with John Brooke, and the scene, which is directly out of the book, where Jo's saying, you mustn't marry John Brooke, and Meg's saying, if he asks me, I'll say I'm too young and I agree with mother and father, I need to wait. And then Aunt March finds her with John Brooke and says, oh, I'm not going to give you any of my money if you marry him. And then Meg says, oh, I love him, and all that kind of thing. And John overhears. You didn't know that was how it happened, did you?
No, you don't get that from 94.
But they do that scene in 1933 and 1949, and it's the most memorable one for Meg, and I think she does it very well, Frances D. In 1949, Meg is played by Janet Leigh. I said she was the next oldest actress after June Allison. She was 22. She was an up-and-comer. And she does that exact scene with that exact script, with the caricaturish Aunt March, and she's very much a caricature herself of a vain older sister who sort of bosses Jo and tells her how to behave and that kind of thing. And again, I think she plays the role very much as the production company and the director wanted. It's a very different performance to the one other of hers that I know, which is Psycho. She does a sort of silly voice and primps and fiddles with her hair and all that kind of thing. So again, very much a caricature, and you certainly get what she's going for. In 1978, she's played by Meredith Baxter Birney, or she might just be called Meredith Baxter now because she's divorced, and she's fine. The feeling I get about that Meg is that she's a bit too grumpy. She's not as nice as she's supposed to be, and I've already talked about that scene with John Brooke and the silk that I find very memorable. And did you know, Jake, that Meg and Amy are supposed to have a special relationship, and Beth and Jo are supposed to have a special relationship?
Not really, no. Just from seeing the plan of their house on the DVD special features and seeing who shared bedrooms, might I gleaned that.
Yes, well, that's another adaptation they made, because in the book, the big ones have a bedroom, and the little ones have a bedroom.
I remember the scene where Meg's kind of mothering Amy and looking after her and giving her the brag money, but I got the sense she kind of do that for any of her little sisters.
Yes, although if you know the book, you would think, oh yes, that's a special relationship. Although it's not in the book as much as the Jo and Beth relationship. But anyway, you do get more of a sense of that in the 1978 version, where they have more time. And again, certainly you get her vanity, you get the bit where she has peer pressure to dress up like a tart, basically, and you get her initial struggle to be in charge of a poor house and not spend too much money. So yeah, certainly you get the character from there, and you know, she's fine. She's blonde, which Meg isn't supposed to be, but never mind. It's just she is a bit too grumpy sometimes. Then in 1994, Meg is played by Trini Alvarado. Again, very good. You very much get the idea of the character from her. I was listening to the director's commentary. Gillian Armstrong is the director, and she was saying they'd had some trouble casting Meg, and they needed a Victorian beauty, fair-skinned and pink-cheeked and all that kind of thing. And I thought, yes, maybe my first thought about Jo being too pretty was wrong. Meg, Trini Alvarado, certainly fits more in with the Victorian ideal of beauty. And again, my Meg, the one I grew up with, so I'm very fond of her. Beth in 1933 is played by Jean Parker, and again she's very theatrical. What kind of character is Beth, Jake?
Well, I found that Beth was the personification of innocence, of childhood, perhaps. She's very charitable, very good-hearted. She wants to make the world a better place, not by force like Joe, but with kindness and compassion and giving the Hummels our bread and that sort of thing. And her role as kind of childhood innocence fits in with her dying as the others grow up out of childhood, I always think. As you were telling me, of course, that's based on real events from Louisa's life, with her sister passing away quite young, and you were telling me that in the book Beth is presented as very angelic, noble, and so I thought, well, the whole concept of the character then is a kind of ideal of childhood innocence, and that very much came across to me in the film that we watched.
Yes, Louisa writes with extreme fondness of Beth and doesn't poke fun at her like she does with herself and her other two sisters for those reasons, and that's why she comes across as sort of quite perfect, too good to be true. The vice that she's trying to overcome in the book is that she's cripplingly shy.
I guess if you get the whole thing with Grandfather Lawrence and their relationship striking up, you would get more of that than we did from the 94 one.
Very true. And Jean Parker portrays this character with softly spoken lines and kind of beatific facial expressions, if that's the right word. I want to say a little bit about when each Beth dies as well. In 1933, they very much go for she's not suffering anymore, she's with God now. Katharine Hepburn goes straight for that. Marmee cries a little bit. Joe cuddles her and says, we must be glad she's gone to heaven, her pain is over. And later on, she sort of talks to the sky, saying, isn't it wonderful, Bethy? So you don't feel too sad because of that, and also because of the very elaborate performance that you can tell that they're acting. In 1949, Beth is played by Margaret O'Brien. Do you know that she is younger than Elizabeth Taylor, who played Amy?
Yes, I remember that.
That really bothered me the first time I watched it, that Beth was the youngest. At the time, it occurred to me, one reason for making Beth so young is that she doesn't have to grow up and get married, so you don't have to worry about her being too young to marry or finding a different actress to play the grown-up version like they did in 1994 with Amy. Also, she gets second billing after June Allison. She was a very famous child star at the time. Apparently, officially, she was 12 when she played Beth. She does always look a year or two older than she's supposed to be. So maybe she lied about her age, maybe she didn't. She was particularly well known, and still is, I think, for Meet Me in St. Louis. So she was a huge name, and they particularly wanted her for this film, and she wasn't suitable for Amy. They wanted her to play the incredibly good sister who dies and tugs at everybody's heartstrings. Again, she's a real caricature, and the way that she plays this incredibly good child, I don't find particularly appealing, having been born in the 1980s. I find it rather over the top, but in 1949, doubtless everyone thought it was wonderful. When she dies, honestly, it's over much too quickly. She does her quite famous speech from the book to Joe, and June Allison's crying and everything. I know I'll be homesick for you even in heaven and all that kind of thing. And then it just suddenly cuts to Joe writing Little Women, but she's called it My Beth, and then Meg comes along and they have a conversation, and then things move on, and you think, well, hang on a minute, what's happened to all the sadness? They don't even grieve. Which in a way is easier to watch, it's less emotionally draining. But I guess they wanted you to get all of it from that speech she does when she's dying in her cutesy child actress voice. You know, for me, that doesn't really work, but it's very much in keeping with the style of the film. In 1978 miniseries, she's played by Eve Plum, and I read that she was 18. So again, she was quite a bit younger than the actress playing Amy, but she was grown up enough for it not to show. She does quite an emotional performance. When she makes that speech, she and Joe have gone to the beach. which actually happens in the book. And Susan Day is doing her very good performance of feeling sad, and Beth's comparing them to different seabirds like she does in the book, and saying that Joe is a gull flying far out to sea and all that kind of thing, and Susan Day is crying. And that's a very emotional scene, and I think she does that particularly well. In 1994, she's played by Claire Danes, who was only about 15 at the time. And on this director commentary, Gillian was telling me that she had to fight some executive type people to get Claire Danes. They wanted someone who was going to be a bigger Hollywood name, but she really wanted Claire Danes for her emotional performance. And what she had done that some people knew about it was she'd starred in a TV series called My So-Called Life about being a teenager. So I guess they eventually thought she wasn't a bad choice to play an iconic teenage character. What did you think of Claire's performance?
Well, I thought it was fine as far as it went. I wanted to see a bit more of Beth than sitting around saying terribly innocent, terribly good, terribly nice things. I guess there wasn't really time, and it seems like all she's really there for is to sit around and be good and then die. I found her as a character, an individual character, with less kind of worth for the film than the other three.
Perhaps it's a good idea to do the whole thing with the piano and making Mr. Lawrence a pair of slippers so you get more idea about the character and her journey.
Yeah, I think we could have done with just something like that with Beth, so she doesn't come across as like a sentient Bible.
Perhaps 1933 has the best stab at that, because when Margaret O'Brien is making slippers and going around to thank him for the piano and crying with emotion, as I say, it's just a bit too much for me, a bit too syrupy.
Whoever said Claire Danes wasn't going to be a big star obviously had to eat their words while watching William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet and Terminator 3.
Her deathbed scene with Winona Ryder as Jo I find unbearably emotional, and I cry, and I think, in fact, I cry at the miniseries as well.
Yeah, it's well done that. It's not too long drawn out, not too short and glossed over. Fits in very well in the movie, definitely gets across the feelings they're going for.
Time to talk about Amy now. She's the youngest sister, and in book 1, she's 12 and turns 13. In 1933, she's played by Joan Bennett, who was 23 and pregnant. I think one of the very low points of the film is right near the beginning when Amy's being introduced and she's getting told off by Mr. Davis, and she's pretend crying. And even taking into account that it's 1933 and how acting was different in those days, I find that bit not quite so enjoyable. Thereafter, she plays the role well enough. Again, like Frances D as Meg, she doesn't get that much to do. I'd say that after Jo, Beth is the sister with the most to do in that film. She looks like Amy with the curly blonde hair. Again, they've paid attention to the descriptions, and it's a fine piece of casting. It doesn't really matter quite so much that she's 23, because films are very different in those days, weren't they? And with the quality of the picture, it wasn't so easy to see if people were in their 20s and pregnant. So maybe people could buy that she was teenaged. In 1949, she's played by Elizabeth Taylor, who's very, very famous indeed, but at the time she wasn't. She was only 17. And a lot of people do like Elizabeth Taylor's performance as Amy, and it's taken me a while to decide what I really think about it, because I used to think, oh, I don't like Elizabeth Taylor as Amy, she's not really acting like Amy. But again, it's because she's being a caricature and everyone else is doing the same thing. I don't know why I found it harder to come to terms with that, or to spot what she was doing, or see the character in the performance. Perhaps because it's not so easy to make a caricature out of Amy. But what she does is she stuffs her face the whole time whenever she's in a scene, which is quite funny. She does a sort of comedy performance that people really enjoy. For instance, when near the beginning of the film they're practicing for their play, and this is out of the book, Jo's telling her how to play the damsel in distress, and in 1933 Katharine Hepburn tells Joan Bennett, you have to say, Roderigo, Roderigo, save me, and faint, and then they go and they practice the scene. And in 1949 it's almost word for word, but then they add a little bit with Amy where she repeats it back to Jo. She says, Roderigo, Roderigo, save me, and faint, which is quite funny. And when she's not getting hit by Mr. Davis, he decides not to hit her in the 1949 version. And in 1933, it doesn't even come up, by the way. But anyway, she's got a caricature of him on her slate, which isn't the trouble she gets into in the book. It's buying limes, which they do in 1994. But anyway, in 1949, she's got a caricature of him, and he says to her, "Did you draw this, Miss March?" And she says, "I think so." And it's quite amusing, and it's not really the sort of thing you get from Amy in the book. So perhaps it was harder for them to make a caricature of Amy, and they had to do their own thing with her a bit more. But now that I get what they were going for, I think Elizabeth Taylor is very good in the role that they gave her to do. She's not really blonde, of course, and her eyebrows give her away, but never mind. In 1978, Amy is played by Anne Dusenberry, and she was about 25. She's actually quite good at playing a bratty youngest sister, and I quite like her performance as Amy, especially in part 2, where she's supposed to be quite a bit older and she's getting married to Laurie in the end and all that kind of thing. You do have to think to yourself, well, I guess maybe she's not actually 12, she's more of a teenager at the beginning of the production, because she really is too old to be playing a 12-year-old. But a very good interpretation of the character there, I think. In 1994, she's played by 2 actresses. Kirsten Dunst as younger Amy March, and Samantha Mathis as older Amy March. On the director's commentary, when Samantha Mathis turned up, Gillian was saying, "Samantha is older Amy." She's Australian. Gillian is, not Samantha. And I didn't know if I wanted 2 different actresses playing Amy, and then she said, "And I'm still not sure." And she'd spent the whole commentary praising the entire cast, but she didn't really say anything about Samantha. But what really came across was that they particularly wanted Kirsten Dunst. They even waited to film some bits. While she finished Interview with the Vampire, they wanted her so much. She was 12 at the time. I believe that she was 12, unlike Margaret O'Brien. And she was born to play young Amy, really. She looks like her, she was good at acting like her, and I always think of her first when I think of Amy.
It very much struck me when we watched it that Kirsten Dunst did all the establishment of Amy as a character, and she did it extremely well. Not only in that scene with Aunt Marge and the Bible, but in everything. She comes across as close as you're going to get in the Little Women group to a youngest bratty sister. As you were saying, selfishness being her vice, but then you could see she very much enjoyed joining in with her sisters, loved her sisters, dressing up and acting out Joe's plays and helping Joe rewrite the play that Amy herself was destroyed in the fire. So you got all sorts of facets of Amy's character from Kirsten Dunst there, which I thought was very good. And it did strike me that the trouble with older Amy, the different actress Samantha, was all she was kind of there to do was just be Kirsten Dunst 4 years older. There's nothing new for her to add to the part. There's nothing she can kind of do. The character's been established so strongly. She just needs to be there looking like Amy, which she does well enough, looking older. So perhaps a difficult role there for Samantha. And I suppose it wouldn't really have looked very convincing to have Kirsten Dunst play her 4 years older as she was so young. So perhaps Gillian's being a bit hard on herself there, and that really was the best they could do.
I think so. It's all they could do. I mean, they're obviously 2 different people. Although now that she's older, Kirsten Dunst looks as much like Samantha Mathis as could reasonably be expected. And it's a shame that they didn't have time to do a bit more with Samantha to maybe develop the character. It's true, everything she does is very much following on from what Kirsten Dunst has set up, like thinking that maybe she's going to marry Fred Vaughan. It's Kirsten Dunst originally who says, "When I marry, I'm going to be disgustingly rich." She certainly looks the part, and that's quite important. And she plays the sophisticated, but also slightly putting on airs and graces because she's young kind of character very well, I think. So yes, as you say, it was always going to be difficult for older Amy to play the role, but I think you couldn't really do better than Samantha Mathis. A few more people to talk about. It's not really worth mentioning Father because he hardly does anything. He's at war for half the production, and then he doesn't do much when he comes back. All fine actors who play Father as much as they get to do, but let's talk about Marmee now. You'll never guess what her name was, the actress in 1933. It was Spring Byington.
No, I would never have guessed that.
She was a good piece of casting, I think. She sort of looks very maternal. She's sort of smiley and round in her mumsy sort of Victorian dresses. The film actually opens with her giving clothes to a man who's going to see his last living son in the hospital in Washington. And you really get how kind and compassionate she is. And it's a bit from the book. In the book, she's telling it to her daughters, and in the film we actually see it, and she says things like, "Oh, it makes me think how ungrateful I am, worrying about my husband when all his 4 sons and I've got my 4 girls to comfort me," and you get the idea of the character, don't you?
Yeah.
So I did think she was very good. In 1949, she's played by Mary Astor. Have you heard that name?
Well, Astor is a very, very famous name. She's one of the New York socialite Astors.
I don't know.
Probably related.
She was quite a famous actress anyway, and I suspect her being in Little Women is largely down to Margaret O'Brien, because apparently she played Margaret O'Brien's mother in Meet Me in St. Louis, and the man who played Father played her father in Meet Me in St. Louis. And I've talked about how big a pull for audiences Margaret O'Brien was. I'm not crazy about Mary Astor in the role of Marmee because she's a bit wooden. I said earlier some of the actors I found were very wooden, and she is one of them. I think possibly she's slightly going for the caricature. She does this sort of mumsy voice, but she doesn't really put much life into it. That's my feeling. Sorry, Mary Astor. In 1978 miniseries, I can't remember the name. Actress. She's good, anyway, and they go into the whole thing about how she, like Jo, has been struggling to control her temper. And they have Amy getting whacked with a ruler, not on screen, but she does this bit where she goes storming out of the house, ready to go and give Mr. Davis a piece of her mind, and then checks herself, comes back in, and you really get that aspect of Marmee's character that there isn't really time for in the films. I don't know if you got that from Susan Sarandon, who played Marmee in 1994. She struggles with her temper.
No, not at all.
If you know, you can spot that she is holding in a lot of anger when Amy's come back having been hit by her teacher, but it's not obvious if you haven't read the book. Another thing that Gillian said on this commentary was that Susan Sarandon's agent didn't want her playing Winona's mother, and I was like, well, why not? And we thought maybe she was too young, so we looked her up, and actually she was a very good age to play Winona Ryder's mother.
Susan Sarandon's agents were obviously very keen on making her appear as young as possible for as long as possible, which is why 3 years earlier she'd played Louise in Thelma and Louise alongside Gina Davis, who we found out was actually 10 years younger than Susan Sarandon. They were supposed to be about the same age in the film. Susan Sarandon did the right thing there, defying her agents and playing the age she was so she would develop as an actress.
Yes, it's a terrible idea that women have to be perceived as being younger than they are once they get to middle age.
Yeah, absolutely ridiculous.
And Gillian told me in her commentary that Susan Sarandon was a fan of the book. And yes, I think she plays Marmee very well. We'll talk about Laurie. 1933, he's played by Douglas Montgomery. And if I had to pick a best Laurie, I might pick him. For me, he's the one who most gets across the mischief and the sense of fun in Laurie. He's also the only one whose hair is even remotely curly. Not curly enough. Louisa's always going on about Laurie's dark curly hair. It says on Wikipedia that Douglas Montgomery was blonde, but it's very difficult to tell in black and white. But anyway, yes, he plays the part of the mischievous boy very well indeed. And then you don't really get to see him very much in part 2. He just sort of comes back married to Amy with a moustache. In 1949, he's played by Peter Lawford, and he's the one I'm really thinking of when I talk about Planks. It's a very, very wooden performance, and what made me notice was watching 1933 version and 1949 version, possibly within a day of each other. And the scene where Jo is saying, the doctor says we have to send for Marmee, she might not get here before Beth dies, and I'm crying and I wish we'd sent for her sooner. And Laurie reveals that he's already sent Marmee a telegram and she's on her way. Again, something that's very quick in 1994 version, isn't it?
Terribly.
And Douglas Montgomery in 1933 gives his lines with real passion and emotion, whereas Peter Lawford in 1949 just sort of stands there and says it. I think, though, it's a style of acting they must have quite liked in the 40s and the 50s, because it reminds me very much of the one who isn't Howard Keel in Calamity Jane. June Allison reminded Jake of Doris Day, while Peter Lawford reminds me of that other person in Calamity Jane.
The one who plays Lieutenant Danny, whatever his name is.
Yes, that one. I mean, he has a certain way of smiling and sort of looking handsome, and perhaps he's trying to be sort of soft and gentle, and that's the kind of man they liked in those days. Again, I don't really get it, because I'm not from that time. For me, the performance does come across as very wooden. 1978 also has a very good Laurie. Again, he has more time to develop the character. You get the difficult relationship with grandfather, which I was talking about earlier. I shouldn't think he's a teenager, but he looks young, and he's very good at acting like a teenager and someone who is a bit mischievous, and when Laurie starts to want to have more freedom and goes off the rails a little bit, that comes across very well. So I do enjoy watching him in the miniseries. 1994, Laurie is played by Christian Bale, and this time when we watched it, I was really looking and thinking, is he more mischievous than I really noticed when I was younger? Because that's really the main thing with young Laurie, he's mischievous. And I thought, well, yes, I suppose he is, when he and Jo are dancing around at the party and they can't really do it properly, and she only knows the men's part and they're laughing. You get that they're having fun together. It's an interesting contrast, actually, to Katharine Hepburn and June Allison dancing with Laurie, because it's like they've been learning with professional teachers, which they probably have for the film. And when they've been to the theatre and Jo and Laurie are spying on John, Brooke and Meg in fun, he gives her the opera glasses and says, let's see what they do. I thought, okay, maybe I haven't been giving Christian Bale his dues. Maybe he does come across as mischievous enough for this film where everything's very sort of quick. And then he has to sort of go off the rails a bit after Jo rejects his marriage proposal, and I think you get that from him going around with the French tarts, who are played by Canadians, which is very clever. They filmed the whole thing, well, much of it, in Canada, and got some Canadians to play French people, and you believe they're in France. Very good illusion there. And he's drinking out of a little flask and all that kind of thing, and chatting up Amy and not being himself. And then after he gets to falling in love with Amy, he sorts himself out and grows up and becomes a man. Did you get that from Christian Bale?
Yes. One of the snippets that you can pick up from the 94 film, which obviously has gone into more detail in the book, is the relationship, the friendship between Laurie and Jo. And from things like the dancing scene and the spying scene, I absolutely got their relationship, friendship, what they liked in each other and brought out in each other, and thought to myself, yes, obviously in the book there's more examples of that. See their friendship built up completely, but you certainly glean it very effectively from the film. It's sparsely but strongly done. I found it interesting what Gillian, the director, was saying about casting Christian Bale. They looked at American actors, and they were, some of them, too beefed up, bulky, not sort of boyish looking, and couldn't really play the transition from boyhood to manhood, which she thought Christian Bale did perfectly and looked right to do, and I certainly can't disagree with her about that. Obviously, he was very carefully selected, and I think he's certainly fit for purpose.
Yes, I think so too now. I always used to feel that he didn't really match up with Laurie in the book, but thinking about it now that I've seen it several dozen times, I think, yes, he is suitable for portraying as much as Laurie as there is time to do in the film.
What would Gillian have thought when he bulked up to be Batman 11 years later? I suppose she'd have thought, oh well, he's grown up now.
Thank goodness he's already done his Laurie for me. Now we need to talk about, he has a few names, the Professor, Professor Bear, Friedrich or Fritz. When we talk about little men, briefly, I shall call him Fritz because that's what they call him there. I don't know what I'm going to call him while we talk about little women. In 1933, anyway, Professor Bear is, again, very much taken straight out of the book. He's considerably older than Joe. I'm not being rude, but he's not particularly attractive. They make him a bit of a sort of funny German, if you'll pardon the expression, not meaning to sound racist or anything, but he's sort of scatty and he has a funny voice, and you can imagine the sort of thing.
Yeah.
But possibly he's the most like Louisa describes him in the book. He's not meant to be sort of sexy. But then in 1949 they get someone who's in his 30s and who is possibly a bit too sexy to play him. And I suppose he's the other performance I think is a bit wooden. But again, he's playing a young man, the one that they want the women to want to be with and the men to want to be. And I guess maybe that was what they liked in 1949. Maybe they thought it was sort of understated.
All these things are a product of their time, and it's hard to judge them in the right way if you're not in that time. But it's a valid thing to do, to compare them, I think. Just bearing in mind that historical context will play a part. A big part.
I've already mentioned that William Shatner is the professor in the miniseries in 1978, which is quite surprising when you first read it, because everyone immediately thinks of Captain Kirk, don't they? I actually think he's very good. I mentioned that he has good chemistry with Susan Day. They have time to go into a lot more detail with his character and what Joe does with him and how they develop. His German accent sounds fine to me. And it's the only one where they've got time to explain that he's looking after his two orphan nephews, Franz and Emil, which I do appreciate, that detail. 1994 has got Gabriel Byrne as the professor. What did you think?
Well, he comes across as quite shabby and displaced and perhaps not comfortable in his environment, but kind of having no choice but to be there. It's quite interesting, some of the things he says about changing political landscape in Germany, or ununified Germany, his feelings about his life and himself and the world in general. And he comes across very much as someone who finds in Joe a kind of light that perhaps had gone out in his own heart, and in that way they have quite a nice relationship developing. It's funny, when he was chatting her up at the theatre and I was saying dirty old pervert, but I was only joking, because I don't think he was really motivated by sexual perversions with the young girl, but by the connection that they were making, which is much nicer.
It is an interesting comment, though, because Gillian was telling me that she wanted to, in a sort of small way, because it's families, portray a sexual attraction between them, which really isn't in the novel. And she says maybe Louisa didn't get to do that because of the time she was writing in, although I've already mentioned there was some hint of the sexual attraction between John Brooke and Meg in the book, haven't I?
Yes. I hope they do have one, Joe and Fritz, as they actually get married.
Well, and I think in the book it's there with Amy and Laurie as well. It's more in the book with Joe and Fritz, Friedrich, Professor Bear, an emotional connection.
Which is more important in many ways, especially if it's going to last.
She never describes him as being handsome or strong or anything like that. And I have to agree with Gillian, you don't get the sense that Joe is sexually attracted to him. I suspect it's got more to do with her attempt to rebel against her publishers and the general public and fans pressuring her into making Joe get married, because she never wanted to do that.
Oh, like she herself, Louisa, didn't.
Exactly. So I think maybe she wanted to do it on her own terms and have her marry someone really unconventional, and she's got the property, Plumfield, when they actually get married, so it's sort of on her terms. So I think it's quite a complex issue, all that. But anyway, Gillian wanted to show that there was a sexual attraction between Joe and the professor, but I think she's also managed to capture the scruffy kind of bachelor who can't really look after himself, as you were saying, as well. So I think maybe they've reached a happy medium between the 1933 funny old man and the 1949 sexy plank of wood.
Yeah, I thought it was a very believable, developing relationship that we perhaps wouldn't find completely conventional, but works very well in its own way. How much older is he than her? About 15 years? More?
In the book, I think about 20. I think she's in her 20s and he's in his 40s. Possibly they're going for Gabriel Byrne as a bit of a younger professor than that.
I say Joe's stopped fighting against the world and is just finding how to survive in it, and she is, but I guess there she shows not going to do things just because convention dictates it, just like Louisa herself, which is good, very in character.
And I think we've finally talked about all the Little Women adaptations enough. I do want to talk about the 3 Little Men adaptations I have seen. They are from 1934, so the very year after the first Little Women talkie, 1940 and 1998. Also in 1998, they made a TV series up in Canada, the 26th episode called Little Men, in which Friedrich is dead. And I haven't really seen any of it except I've seen an outtake reel, and it reminds me very much in terms of the sort of style and atmosphere of things like Dr. Quinn. And I don't think I like it, to be honest. None of the adaptations have anything like all the March grandchildren in them. Joe's supposed to have 2 sons, and this one, the TV series I've never seen, seems to only have Rob, who's played by 8-year-old twins, and he's supposed to be much the same age as Amy's daughter Bess, but she's played by a teenager in this. No mention of any of Meg's children. So that's all I know about it. Oh, but apart from one other thing, there's this sort of sexy caretaker character, who I suspect has earthed with Joe, but I could be wrong about that. But anyway, I don't think it looks like much good. So I'll talk about the films now. When I was reading about Little Women and when it was adapted and if there are any Little Men adaptations I might be interested in, I found out that this 1934 film existed, and I was able to download it from this website where you can download classic films for free, which I was very pleased about it. And I watched the film, and I liked it. It stars Erin O'Brien Moore as Joe, and I seem to remember Friedrich is called Ralph Morgan. Because it's only a year later, it's similar in style to the Katharine Hepburn film in that everyone's very much acting out, I think is the expression. What they always do in Little Men adaptations is they take one aspect, which is the troubled boy Dan and the trouble he gets into and coming out the other end, and Joe looking after him at Plumfield. And this was the first attempt to do that, I suppose. The 2 characters that need the most chemistry in a Little Men film, it strikes me, are Joe and Dan. Erin O'Brien Moore as Joe is very good. She's very maternal. She's also sort of young at heart and fun, like Joe is supposed to be. There's this scene where she's flying a kite and she trips over a shrubbery, for instance. And I've been sitting here trying to remember the name of the teenage boy who played Dan, but I can't think of it, which is a shame because I thought he was actually very good. He's about 17 at the time, I think. Dan's supposed to be 14. He's quite short, and when I was reading about him on Wikipedia, I don't know how true this is, it said that in later life he had trouble getting parts because he was too short. And I read lots of interesting things about him, like he used to perform in the circus when he was very young, before Little Men. So in the scene where Dan has to do this backflips, they're very, very professional, and he even does a full turn in the air without putting his hands on the floor. So it's a bit like Katharine Hepburn and her singing and her dancing. It's sort of too polished to be true, but they weren't really trying to be true in these films, were they? They were trying to perform. So because of the style of acting at the time, he's very theatrical. He cries real tears, and he puts a lot of actual emotion in his voice rather than sort of trying to hide it and show it to the audience in other ways, which is what the real Dan would have done. But I find his performance very charismatic, and I do like him as an actor, and I think it's a shame that he was not really getting anything better to do than delivery boy in his 30s in The Addams Family. One thing I particularly like about that production is that Jo has both her sons, Rob and Teddy, and Amy is mentioned, and Laurie's in it as well. And I think on the Internet Movie Database it says somebody is Amy uncredited. But there are about 3 blonde women at Laurie's birthday party. So I think whoever wrote that might have been having a guess as to which one was Amy and who she was. So you don't get the whole family, but you do at least get all the children at Plumfield. There are supposed to be Jo's sons, Rob and Teddy, and Meg's twins, Daisy and Demi. They mess about with the story order a little bit, but let's not go into boring detail about that. Overall, I think it's a very good first attempt to adapt Little Men into a film. The next one was in 1940, and that was not a good attempt. I don't know whether it possibly set a precedent for seriously messing about with the plots of stories when you're making an adaptation. But it was about Dan, but it starts off as being about 2 swindlers who end up with this baby on their hands who turns out to be Dan, and they're in trouble with the law. And this has got nothing to do with what Louisa May Alcott wrote. But anyway, Dan ends up at Plumfield, where Jo, played by Kay Francis, is. In some ways a similar name to Francis B, isn't it? And Fritz, and I can't remember who played him, and I haven't re-watched this one for the podcast because I didn't want to. As a film, it's fine. As an adaptation, it's seriously lacking. But anyway, there's this whole thing about trying to get $5,000 to extend the lease on Plumfield, and what's wrong with that, Jake?
It's been left to Jo by Aunt March. It doesn't have a lease.
So clearly they've sort of ignored all that and very much done their own thing. And again, it's all about Jo and Dan. And I was reading the cast of this on the Internet Movie Database before I watched it. I watched it on YouTube. Probably find it if you want to. And it said Daisy, Demi, played by some people. And it said Rob and Teddy. And I thought, oh good, both Jo's children are in it. But then when I watched it, if Rob was there, no one ever pointed him out or seemed to realise that he was Jo's son. It was all Teddy. And it also said somebody is Bess. And Bess, as I think I've mentioned, is Amy's daughter. And I thought, oh good, Bess is going to be in it. But she wasn't. And there was one scene, I think, where there was a little girl with long blonde hair who you could see from behind. And I looked again on the Internet Movie Database. It said whoever played Bess was uncredited. So if that's true, it's very well recognised by somebody. No one ever bothers about Josie, who's Meg's other daughter, but in Little Men she's the new baby and not really in it at all, so that's understandable. I'm going to ask Jake now if he remembers the bit where Fritz punishes Nat for lying.
Yes, I do. That's one of the bits I remember from the 1998 Little Men, which we sat and watched several months ago. It's a rather striking way of punishing Nat. Friedrich has Nat smack him with a ruler rather than the other way round. And the idea is that Nat's not going to want to smack the professor with a ruler, so that's a better deterrent than getting smacked himself. Which is quite innovative, I suppose. It relies on you not wanting to hurt the person who's punishing you, which might not always work, but it does for Friedrich.
Yes, it certainly works on Nat. The Alcotts had a lot of very innovative ideas, and they were very much against corporal punishment for children, and so they are at Plumfield. It's a very memorable scene. Do you remember what Friedrich told Nat that his Friedrich's grandmother, did to him to stop him from lying?
Putting something in his mouth?
Not quite. He says that she cut the end of his tongue. And what I found quite interesting was that he didn't say that in 1934. They had that very scene, but instead of saying she cut the end of my tongue, he says that she washed his mouth out with soap.
Oh, that's where I got that.
And I thought, well, that's much more tame, isn't it? Which reminds me that when Dan sets the bedroom on fire, it's much less serious than in the 1998 version, which we'll talk about in a moment. But in 1998, Fritz does say she drew my tongue out of my mouth and snipped to the end with scissors and all that kind of thing. In this 1940 version, which I don't really like very much, they really do make it all about Dan and Joe by having that scene happen with the two of them. Joe gets Dan to hit her with the ruler, which is very different from the book. And if you are strict about what should and shouldn't happen in an adaptation, it might be a bit too much of a liberty, but then you wouldn't like this film anyway, because of it being about two swindlers and the lease on Plumfield. Now we'll talk about the 1998 version, which Jake has seen.
Yes. The impressions I remember from that were I kept thinking that Dan had finally come round and turned over a new leaf, and then he did something else even worse and hadn't fully come round, which I thought was a bit strange. If he was building up to it later in the movie, I don't think he should have quite seemed to have been sorry and learned his lesson so much with everything he did earlier on. They had this wild horse that they just kept in this field for years and years and didn't try and feed it or tame it or let it go or anything, which Dan eventually tames, doesn't he? So obviously it was there entirely for that purpose. And I remember the game in the barn where you drop the knife and it might stab you in the foot, and that's kind of Dan leading the boys astray and teaching them habits that they're trying to get drummed out of them at Plumfield, and I find that scene kind of rings true and is good for establishing Dan's character and is a good point to take him away from by the end of the movie. So I thought it worked pretty well as a movie, but it was quite confusing when its conclusion of Dan's journey was actually going to happen.
Well, that's because I think when Little Men is adapted, they're adapting sort of 2 or 3 chapters out of several, which is the Dan story arc. In the book, all sorts of things happen, like Nan, who's a girl who goes to the school, gets robbed, lost when they go berry picking, and there's this really very charming chapter where Joe is teaching Daisy and Bess to cook on a working toy stove sort of thing. But it doesn't really have a lot of plot. And what they take is Dan coming to Plumfield and being seriously troubled and turning over a new leaf. So in the book, all that doing bad things and getting punished, where in the film he seems to have learned his lesson, it's all one chapter and it's very quick. And the game of stick knife that you were mentioning, that's the bit with the backflips. And Tommy is saying, "Oh, teach me how to do the backflips," and Dan gets him to agree to give him his penknife, and then he says, "Just keep it up till you learn," and doesn't really teach him. And in the book it says Dan agreed to play for the knife with a game of stick knife, which Tommy won. And that's all it says, and in the film they turn it into this big dramatic scene. The horse, by the way, is Laurie's horse, which he's bought new and it's not broken in yet, and they're looking after it at Plumfield for him.
Yeah, you don't get that from the film. They've just got this field with a wild horse in it they don't do anything about.
It seems a bit strange, doesn't it? But Laurie isn't even mentioned in that film. At the end, when it's Christmas, there's this blonde woman who I like to think is Amy, but no one says hello Amy or anything to her. You catch 2 glimpses of her. That branch of the family is not mentioned, which I find quite disappointing. They do, which neither of the other films does, the death of John Brooke. Now in the book, John isn't even in it until he's dying, and you're expected to have read the previous books and know who he is. But in this 1998 film, which is also Canadian, by the way, and it was not theatrically released, I think it's a shame they don't do a Little Men adaptation sort of properly. But anyway, they wanted to do the death of John Brooke and make it part of the Dan and Nat plot. So what they do is they have John, rather than Laurie, be the one who sends Nat to Plumfield and pays his tuition. And he can't afford to sponsor boys off the street, so obviously it makes much more sense for Laurie to do that, which he does in the 1934 version, which is why he's in it very briefly. And because it's a film and it has to be very sort of dramatic, John drops down dead in front of everybody. And Nat and Dan, who are protagonists rather than supporting characters get to join in and be sad because it's because of him that they're at Plumfield. So they very much interwoven it all and made it much less episodic than the book. I'm quite sure they made that film in 1998 with Winona Ryder and her friends very much in mind. The music that it opens with reminds me very much of the music that opens the 1994 Little Women film. And it's not that similar in terms of the melody, but it has a very similar sort of feel and style to it. And also, Fritz is played by Chris Sarandon, who is Susan Sarandon's ex-husband. And when I was finding out about this film, and I was buying this American VHS, it's very difficult to find these Little Men films and watch them, especially in this country. I noticed the name Sarandon on there, and it struck me. And I'm sure that was deliberate. I don't say it's the only reason he got the part. It's a very good bit of casting. I do think his name being Sarandon is what made them think of him. Jo is played by Mariel Hemingway, and she's very good. And Dan, I do remember his name, he's played by Ben Cook, and another very talented, charismatic performance by a young actor playing Dan. By the way, the one in 1940 was getting rather into the sort of caricature territory, which is quite interesting, really, because it's about 9 years before that Little Women film was made. But anyway, I was looking up Ben Cook on the Internet Movie Database, and he doesn't seem to have done much acting after he grew up, and he's been things like Older Boy on Subway. So maybe he grew up and lost all his appeal, just like the young actors in Mike and Angelo.
Yes, it very often happens with the young actors.
I mentioned the fire scene earlier, didn't I, in the 1934 version? Do you remember that one from 1998?
Only as a kind of part of the sequence of events of Dan seeming to come round and not.
That's what actually makes them send him away. In the book and in that film, it's the order that they mess about with in 1934. But anyway, that scene is much more serious in 1998, much more violent. It says in the book, after the kind of frenzy of getting everybody out and putting out the fire, it says Tommy had a bad burn on his arm and was half crazy with pain. And in the film, you actually see his nightshirt catch fire, and Silas, the sort of caretaker person, has to come and put it out, and Tommy's screaming and everything, and you see them treating the burn, and it's really bad, and a lot more things in the room catch fire and are damaged than in 1934. And it strikes me that they must have felt they couldn't be at all kind of violent and have children getting seriously hurt, or even mention the idea of cutting someone's tongue with scissors. And that reminds me, actually, it strikes me how those Little Men films particularly very much reflect the time that they were made rather than the time that they're set. Plumfield has a black cook called Asia. In 1934, she's played by Hattie McDaniel, who won the first ever Academy Award for a black person. She won it for Gone with the Wind. And at the end of the film, it's Thanksgiving, and Joe's saying, let's all join hands around the table. So everybody joins hands, servants included, except Asia. Now, isn't that interesting?
Yes, that very much would reflect the attitudes of the time, the 30s.
I don't think Louisa would have approved of that. I think she would have either had all the servants in her circle or left them to their own circle, which was different but equal, shall we say. I don't remember much about Asia in 1940, but I do remember that she's there. She's not even in the 1998 version. I guess they don't want to get into that, whether black people are in service to white people and whether they're seen as equal. So, in fact, all the characters are white in the 1998 one. What is quite interesting, though, about 1940 is what the children are being taught in this schoolroom scene. It was pretty much exactly the same as what I'd been reading about in one of Enid Blyton St. Clair's books, which was only a year or two later. And it was about the principal products of all these different African countries. And I'm not saying that they definitely didn't teach them that in the 1870s. I have no basis for saying that. but I do think they got the idea from what children were currently learning at school in the early 1940s.
So perhaps it'd be fair to say Little Men adaptations are sometimes too much influenced or biased by the time in which they were made, rather than just presented in the way they liked at the time, like the Little Women film.
That's very interesting. It comes across much more in the Little Men films. Little Women, sometimes people like to write about how the relationships between the men and the women are perhaps more equal in the newer one than the older ones. And in Little Men as well, Fritz and Joe have a much more equal relationship in 1998 in the black and white ones. He's going around telling her what to do and she's meekly obeying him. But what an interesting point. And that really is, I think, everything I need to say.
Some food for thought for you there to mull over while you wait for our next podcast, which will be on CITV game shows, as I'm going to title it. Again, a slightly different direction next time than this time. Specifically, we're going to talk about Funhouse, Finders Keepers, and Terror Towers, which will be fascinating and nostalgic. Until then, thanks for listening today.
And in the meantime, good night out there.
Whatever you are.